Refugee Camp, Z Zombies, Clock Time 2. Extended version. This story is fictional and has no relation to real events or existing people. Any resemblance to reality is just a coincidence. Love, chiz, zombies, and science, fiction. ES, fiction. Part 1, To the Past. Unconsciousness, voracity, and brutality, define predators. Define the corrupt. Define zombies. After the last events of La Rosa Buena and the trip to the past of the Watchmen, at the beginning of the Ghoul Cataclysm, we developed the project research, and I was selected among the volunteers. After a period of instruction under the direction of Mental, Sean, Helen and Rafaela, and the rest of the ancient internet of the pre-chaos period to practice the language of the time. He considered me a language expert of the 21st. With the best wishes of success on the mission, several of us were transported by Mental using the mysterious time displacement device to different dates and locations and prior to the onset of the cataclysm. Mental, the robot with artificial intelligence, easily crossed the boundaries of the network by establishing digital identities and various small bank accounts, and so I presented myself in the refugee camp as a simple volunteer of foreign origin, and the foreign would justify my strange accent among other details on which I could draw attention. Coming from a future when barely the new, more mature, healthy, and balanced civilization rises poorly but with superior technologies from the apocalyptic ruins of the 21st century zombie cataclysm. Among the things that surprised me from the past at first impression, was the decomposition and smoke fever that spilled through the narrow streets of the refugee camp. The burning smell that I later discovered appeared along with the terrifying noise of the petrol engines, and I saw the walls covered with graphite and dry spots. Some of the refugees, with empty gazes of demeaned eyes, wandered like shadows. The world hadn't collapsed yet, and I was an intruder in that nightmare of the past. My false identity as a foreign volunteer provided me with a facade, but I could not hide my amazement at the cruelty of reality. I didn't define in principle whether the technology one carried embedded in me seemed useful here. He had access to the network, to interfere with drones, to the beginnings of artificial intelligence, and to chaos and survival. I observed the other volunteers, John Bai, Lillian, and the sister Lorraine, who at first I did not know whose sister she was. It was a team assembled like so many others, and we shared an altruistic task of overwhelmingly confronting the corrupt, and I should not leave traces. If possible, nor my ADN. Mental had warned me of the dangers. The predators were ruthless human factions that fought for power and personal gain driven by various psychopathologies as dangerous or more dangerous as the ghouls. I should move with caution, collect information, and avoid attracting attention because they would use me as a currency of exchange for personal gain of any kind without the slightest scruple. So, with my accent made a mixture of inherited tones and my mind filled with futuristic knowledge, I plunged into the shit of the past. Every corner, every shadow, seemed to hide detonators of sorrows, passions and unresolved conflicts. I was asking myself again, what events led to the collapse? How did the zombie collapse originate, what was the cause? And, above all, how could we find a way to develop a solution to the implicit evil? Unconsciousness, voracity, and brutality defined predators. But they also defined the corrupt, those who took advantage of chaos for their own personal gain. Could we find answers before time runs out? The volunteers had been deposited at points and moments considered strategic by the theorists of the analysis department of Silas Hills, and all the people we saw, and with whom we should relate as little as possible and try not to alter their behavior to avoid historical modifications, which would generate paranoid conditioning. My thoughts and my decisions are limited. I presented myself in the coordination office with a plastic folder with printed paper sheets with the data of my supposed personality, but it was not the paper or plastic of the time, it was diffuminable material developed in the future to avoid the generation of non-recyclable waste. The coordinator turned out to be a man too young for his post and I did not notice him very committed to his job. My first impression was disappointing, then I discovered, that was later, that I had accessed that post due to the higher remuneration and the small detail of having accused the previous coordinator for illegal practices. After checking the data, I archived it in my built-in memory device. Objectively, that was something that had happened over 100 years ago. It was very, very far from the region where La Rosabuena would rise and even further away from the old Silas Hills, and by the drone visits of my time we suspected that there had been very few or no survivors of the zombie cataclysm in hundreds of kilometers, and the refugee camp was near the border of an extremely brutal and conflicting political region from where most of the refugees from illegal, political persecution came, and it was all kinds of people who fled in search of survival to fall into an environment of poverty, misery, and corruption. After having presented myself to perform functions as a volunteer in the refugee camp, I met John Bai, a professional driver of vehicles who donated part of his time for the common good, was a man of broken, dark skin, although not as much as those of the Colson Masiamoto family of the Rosabuena of my time, Lillian, a very simple middle-aged woman with a pair of huge eyes almost abnormal and very beautiful, and Sister Lorena, along with her other two sisters to whom I did not notice even the most remote physical resemblance to each other that until the database clarified to me that they were names of devotion. The three were usually very quiet, but I heard them several times naming their father of devotionality, such a George, which I didn't see at those moments. Then I knew that he only appeared sometimes one day a week. Likewise, I should be watching everyone, looking for clues and possible points of origin of evil Z. I could not take samples or take anything that would affect the development of events, so I decided, on the recommendation of my instructors, to look for a rental room in the nearby village, called El Peligro, where I found a little abandoned place that was falling into pieces and that the supposed owner rented me at draconian price because of my insistence, because I already knew that I would not find anything in worse conditions, and unless another person, or someone with a minimum of decency chose that place. Weather, 7 hours and 24 minutes from my arrival, my contact with the locals remains almost null. I am barely a curiosity of poor clothes and speaking in a low voice with a strange accent. Today, when I woke up in the separate room that I rented at El Peligro, I felt the moisture of the air slipping through the rains of the walls. The smell of mold and abandonment mixed with the echo of my thoughts. What had prompted me to come as a volunteer researcher to this forgotten corner of the world? I got up looking at the walls unclogged, thinking about where to get a cup of tea, had slept dressed on a wet cardboard, rubbed my face and conditioned my clothes as much as I could, and checked the systems integrated in the false scars of my forearm, and I went out to the street inclined and the sun hit my eyes mercilessly, and covering them with a hand I headed towards a house that had a coffee shop poster. When I entered I perceived an intense smell that I did not identify, and then another. That reminded me of the burned meat, while I was surprised to see a familiar face. It was Rena, my contemporary of the Vigilance, of Silas Hills. She was behind the bar, accommodating some translucent glasses. That must be plastic, I thought, or she was someone with an identical resemblance, detail that I should not rule out because of the huge population of the moment, and there could be a high degree of probability of a casual resemblance or of a common ancestor, and my surprise turned into disappointment. I approached Rena, staring at her, noticed something strange that I did not identify in her, who, when he noticed my proximity, turned to me asking me what I wanted. "Do you have a cup of tea?" I asked him, lowering my tone of voice to almost a snorkel full of disappointment. He looked at me strangely in his face and said in the rough tone with which I heard the locals speak, "Yes, but a man drinking tea? Is he sick or is he English?" He ended up asking me with an aggressive smile and added, "Soon your tea will be ready," he said to me by imitating my tone of voice. I had been warned that at this time a very intense black tea was consumed which they called coffee with a high content of alkaloids, and that being careful with everything that consumed would be the motto. Rena, within the next minute, came back with a smoky cup of aroma tea. At home, my home, was wild mint tea, my Silas Hills tea, of the future, and my disappointment turned to renewed hope. Rena lifted up one of her sleeves and I could see that she was carrying on her forearm a scar very similar to mine. "We already know who we are," he whispered to me. "Here only the elderly women consume this infusion. Make sure they don't see you with this, because despite public policies of inclusion, woke, Me Too will question your masculinity and murmur about you, and our motto is not to draw attention." It surprised me. I had read about the subject but still had it as something distant. Raha interrupted my thought by asking me if I had already obtained accommodation or if I was hiding in the woods. "I got a square on Matanzas Street, one that is bent almost at the corner with Yanez. You will recognize it by the oxide in its metal plates. I told him. And where are you staying? I asked him. Here in front, next to the massage house, that of the red lights at night, he said, pronouncing night with sensual sinusity. I'd ask you more. I rushed my tea with flavor to home and retired with the feeling of having forgotten something. Then I came back and paid my consumption with paper notes like in the old movies. As I headed toward the exit of the village towards the refugee camp, I saw a place full of fruit and vegetables, and I forgot the mission, the zombie cataclysm that followed, and forgot about Rena and the refugees, and I handed over several money papers to bring me a nourished amount of fresh food that I was consuming on my more than an hour's walk to the camp. I arrived at the coordinator's office with a margin of time to take my turn. John By, the driver of the vehicle, came behind my